Hey everyone. I hope everyone is having a good evening. And so I decided to go ahead and start on chapter 12. Chapter 12 is, and I forgot to get to it on my notes too. Okay, here we go. So, chapter 12 is about God's call of Abram and Abram in Egypt. Now, remember in or chapter 11, we had discussed how God changed Abram's name to Abraham. So let's go ahead and continue on with chapter 12. So, the first section is God's promise to Abram. And we're going to start with verse 1 through 3. And 1 through 3 talks about how God's previous covenant with Abram. And it says, verse 1 through 3 says, "Now the Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, into a land that I will shew thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed." So let's go ahead and break that down, shall we? So in verse 1, okay, when it says, "Now the Lord had said to Abram." So let's look at that. So in the book of Acts, chapter 7, verse 2 through 4, God revealed through Stephen, I think it's Stephen, that his promise was made to Abram when he was in I can't ever say that name, Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Haran. And that's in Genesis chapter 12, verse 1 through 3. So, Genesis, these 3 verses repeats a promise, okay, that God had said to Abram. God repeated the promise now that his father was dead, and Abram was compelled to a more complete obedience. We see Abram as an example of growing in faith and obedience. And 1 through 3 explains how God promised Abram a land, a nation, and a blessing. And when it says in verse 1, "To a land that I will shew you," shew means to show. So basically it says, "To a land that I will show you." So that means that God promised Abram a land. Specifically, God promised the land of Canaan. And in verse 2, when it says, "I will make you a great nation." So what he's saying here is that God promised to make a nation from Abram. And he will have children, descendants, enough to populate a great nation. And when it says, "and make your name great," and what he means by that is God promised to bless Abram and to make his name great. And in verse 3 where it says, "I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curse you." So this promise inherited by the covenant descendants of Abram, which is the Jewish people, it remains true to this day. And then it says, "In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So what that means is God promised to not only give him blessings, but also to make him a blessing. And this amazing promise was fulfilled in the Messiah that came from Abram's lineage. God's blessing to Abram was not for his own sake of the Jewish nation to come, it was for the whole world, for all the families of the earth through Jesus Christ. All right, next verse we're going over is verse 4. And verse 4 talks about Abram's departure from Haran. So verse 4 says, "So Abram departed, as the Lord had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran." So when it talks about, a little fun fact, Abraham's brother, Haran, had a son named Lot, and that's where Lot came from. So when in verse 4 it says that Lot went with him, this was partial obedience. God commanded him to go out from your family, his family, which is in, verse 1. Yet he brought his nephew Lot with him. Because in verse 1 that I read, "Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house into a land that I will show thee." So basically he is saying, it was a partial obedience because he went, but he took his nephew, Lot, which is Abram's brother's son. All right, let's go on to the next verses. This is the next two verses, 5 and 6. And 5 and 6 is talks about Abram's arrival in Canaan. And 5 and 6 says, "And Abram took Sarah, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son, and all their substance that they had gathered, and the souls that they had gotten in Haran, and they went forth to go into the land of Canaan, and into the land of Canaan they came. And Abram passed through the land into the place of Shechem, it's either Shechem or Sichem, unto the plain of Moreh. And the Canaanite was then in the land." So let's break these verses down a little bit into more depth. So verse 5. When it says all the substance they gathered and the people they have acquired in Haran. So Abram left Ur, with his father Terah and nephew Lot, stopping in Haran long enough to acquire many possessions and people. And when it says came into the land of Canaan, Abram came into Canaan as a stranger, to live in a land populated by tribes that were set in violence and sin, which is reference Genesis chapter 34, verse 1 through 5. But would become even worse. So, which is in Genesis chapter 15, verse 16. You can reference that. So, Abram came into Canaan as a stranger, to live in a land populated by tribes that were set in violence and sin, but it would only become worse. And then in verse 6, where it says, Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem. So, this was Abram's first stopping point in Canaan, was Shechem. He came to a notable oak tree, which is the terebinth tree of Moreh, which later appears as the first capital of the kingdom of Israel following the split of the united monarchy. The name Shechem, little fun fact, excuse me, my nose itches. The name Shechem means shoulder. Shechem was not only in the midst of two mountains, but it was also right in the middle of Canaan. That's where Shechem was. A few references about verse 5 and 6, and then Shechem. A little tidbit of information. So, how many do I have here? So I have eight things regarding Shechem. So in Genesis chapter 33, verse 18, excuse me, my nose itches, guys, I'm sorry. This is where Jacob came safely when he returned with his wives and children from the sojourn of Laban. Number 2, Genesis chapter 33, verse 19. Excuse me, guys. I'm so sorry. I'm really tired today. Jacob bought a piece of land from the Canaanite named Hamor for 100 pieces of silver. Number 3, Genesis chapter 33, verse 20. This is also where Jacob built an altar to the Lord and called it, I cannot pronounce it, but it's spelled Elohe. Elohe. This established the connection between Jacob and what became known as Jacob's Well. Number 4, in Genesis chapter 34, Shechem was the place where Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, was raped, and the sons of Jacob massacred the men of the city in retaliation. Number 5, in Genesis chapter 48, verse 22, this was the plot of ground that Jacob gave his son Joseph, land, and Jacob had conquered from the Amorites with his sword and bow in an unrecorded battle. And number 6, in Joshua chapter 24, verse 32, Shechem is where the bones of Joseph were eventually buried when they were carried up from Egypt. Number 7, in Joshua chapter 24, Shechem is also where Joshua made a covenant with Israel, renewing their commitment to the God of Israel and proclaiming, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." And number 8, in the book of John, chapter 4, verse 5 and 6, Shechem's New Testament name is Sychar, Sychar. This is where Jesus met the Samaritan woman at the well. So those are a few notes, biblical notes, that we got from more information about Shechem. All right, in verse 6, let's continue on to verse 6 now. And where it says Canaanites was then in the land. So Abram came to the land that God promised him. Yet the Canaanites were still in the land. And they had no intention of giving up the land to Abram, and would not give it up until they were forced out some 400 years later. That's a very long time. So let's go on to verse 7, 8, and 9. So those the next three verses, 7, 8, and 9, talks about how God appears to Abram in Canaan. So 7 through 9 says, "And the Lord appeared unto Abram and said, Go unto thy seed will I give this land. And there builded he an altar unto the Lord who appeared unto him. And he removed from thence into a mountain on the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent, excuse me, having Bethel on the west, and Hai on the east. And there he builded the altar unto the Lord, and called upon the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed, going on still toward the south." So in verse 7, when it talks about how the Lord appeared to Abram. So once he was in the land, God reminded him of his promise. And when he says, "To your descendants I will give this land." So Abram never owned any of this land except the burial plot he bought. And you can reference that in Genesis chapter 23, verse 14 through 20. Yet God's promise was enough evidence to assure that Abram did indeed own the whole country. And when it talks about how he built the altar to the Lord, the altar was important to Abram. And because it was a place to meet with God and to offer a sacrifice for sin and to show submission to God and to worship God. And in verse 8, when he says he pitched his tent, Abram was a tent dweller. Okay, he never lived in a house. He always lived in a tent. And tents are the home of those who are just passing through and do not put down permanent roots. Also, you can reference that in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11. All right, so next is the next section is Abraham in Egypt, or Abram in Egypt. And we're going to go on to verse 10. And verse 10 is about Abram's faith is tested by famine. So verse 10 says, "And there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down into Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was grievous in the land." So when it says, "and Abram went down into Egypt," that means it was a temporary stay. And Abram went down into Egypt to sojourn there. So sojourn means temporary stay. So he was only staying there temporarily. For the famine was grievous in the land. So grievous means very severe or very serious. And so many people died from hunger. And when Abram went down to Egypt, so what he's saying here is that harm came from his trip. Even though God blessed and protected him while he was in Egypt. All right, let's go on to the next three verses, verses 11 through 13. And 11 through 13 talks about sensing a potential danger in Egypt, and Abram persuades Sarai to lie on his behalf. Sarai is Sarah. So 11 through 13 says, "And it came to pass when he was come near to enter into Egypt, that he said unto Sarai his wife, Behold now, I know that thou art a fair woman to look upon. And there it shall come to pass, when the Egyptians shall see thee, that they shall say, This is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will save thee alive. Say, I pray thee, thou art my sister, that it may be well with me for thy sake, and my soul shall live because of thee." So in verse 14, where it says the Egyptians saw that Sarai was indeed fair. So basically what that means is she attracted attention because she was very, very beautiful. And she was a companion of a very wealthy, influential man. So in verse 15, where it says the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. So understanding the place Abram and Sarai have in God's redemptive plan, we realize how serious this was. And God did not want Sarai's womb to be defiled by a Gentile king, because the Messiah would come from her line of descendants. So God had a plan all along. You have to trust God's plan, as we do today. All right, so the next one, 16 through 20. So, oh, I'm sorry, that was 14 and 15. Oh, I'm sorry, I kind of jumped ahead. I'm sorry. Hold on just a second. I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. So that was 14 and 15. I'm sorry, I skipped the notes on 11 and 13. So, 11 and 13, 11 through 13. Okay, in verse 11, where it says, I know that thou art a fair woman to look upon. So Abram was concerned about his 60-year-old wife's attractiveness to the Egyptians. And in 13, where he pleads and says, please say you are my sister. So this was, in fact, half-truth if you really want to think about it, because she was Abram's half-sister. And that's in Genesis chapter 20, verse 12. You can reference that. But then in 14 and 15, which I did not read, I'm sorry, it says, and it came to pass that when Abram was come into Egypt, the Egyptians beheld the woman that she was very fair. The princes also of Pharaoh saw her and commended her before Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And that is why Pharaoh took Sarah into his house. But like I said, God had a plan for everything. Okay. You know, the long lifespan of Abram and Sarai also helps to explain her beauty. Since Abram lived to be 175 and Sarai to be 127, this was only middle age for her, and perhaps corresponding to what we think of her as her 30s, since she lived to be 127. I go on biblical facts, but a Jewish legend says that Abram went into Egypt. He tried to hide Sarai in a box. When Egyptian customs officials asked what he had in the box, he said barley. No, they said it contains wheat. Very well, answered Abram. I'll pay the custom on wheat. Then the officer said it contained pepper. Abram said he would pay the custom charges on pepper. Then the officer said it contained gold. Abram said he would pay the custom charges on gold. Then the officer said it contained precious stones. Abram said then he would pay the custom charges on the stones. By this time, the officers insisted on opening the box. And when they did, all of Egypt shined with the beauty of Sarai. These same legends say that in comparison to Sarai, all other women looked like monkeys, and that she was even more beautiful than Eve. Now that is just a legend passed down, so I don't know anything much about that. But that was something I did see, and I just kind of wanted to share just because it's a legend, and we don't really know. All right. Now verses 16 through 20. These next 5 verses, sorry, I was reading something. This talks about, 16 through 20 talks about how Abram leaves Egypt after being rebuked by the Pharaoh. So, 16 through 20 says, and 16 through 20 is the last chapter, or verses of chapter 12. And he entreated Abram well for her sake, and he had sheep and oxen and asses and men servants and maid servants and she asses and camels. And the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. And Pharaoh called Abram and said, What is this that thou hast done unto me? Why didst thou not tell me that she was thy wife? Why saidst thou, She is my sister, so I might have taken her to me to wife? Now therefore, behold thy wife, take her and go thy way. And Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away and his wife and all that he had. So in verse 16, where it says he treated Abram well for her sake. So what that means is that God blessed Abram even when he didn't do what he should. God continued to protect Abram even when Abram acted like a liar. God didn't call back his promise to Abram because the promise depended on God and not Abram. In verse 18, when it says, What is this you have done to me? So a pagan king had to rebuke Abram. God's divine protection of Abram and Sarai, that if he would have trusted God and told the truth, everything would have been all right. But he made that boo-boo. He made that mistake. You know, God was in the business of growing Abram into a man of great faith. And this required circumstances where Abram must trust God. You know, faith is not a mushroom that grows overnight in damp soil. It's an oak tree that grows for 1,000 years under the blast of wind and rain. All right, so that sums up chapter 12. All right, in my next video, I will continue on with chapter 13 in the book of Genesis. Thank you, guys.